Yo, what up, man? What you doing last night? Who, Rocky? Where you was at? The same place? Damn. Yeah. I mean, I was already asleep by that time. Knock him out. Yo, Rocky ain't no fucking joke, man. He the truth. Mm. Mm. Let the young boy come whip him up. Ooh, look at him. What you getting into today? All right, I might get with you later on. Day my birthday, bro. I don't know, man. My friend she want to take me out for lunch when she get off work or early dinner, I guess, because she don't get off till like two something. But uh, my little young buck, yeah, trying to take me out for sushi and shit. But so I ain't got no. That's the only plans I have for the day, really. All right, all right, bro. Peace. Motherfucking Rocky to knock somebody else out. All right, just making sure the camera was the right way.
I will show you the science of actually how the cells work, and you will have more knowledge than most doctors in the world today because they still believe in the genes. You are made out of 50 trillion cells, and the cells are the living entities. So you are a community, not a single person. Every cell in your body has minus voltage on the inside and positive voltage on the outside. Every live cell is a battery. Every cell has about 1.4 volts. 50 trillion cells. in the body times 1.4 volts is 700 trillion volts of electricity in your body right now. And with training and meditation, you can focus this energy called chi, and you can use that energy for healing. So while you see yourself as a physical entity, the new physics, you are energy waves interacting with each other right now. All animals and all plants communicate with vibration. The gazelle doesn't have to go up to the lion and say, "Are you my friend?" Because at the distance, the energy can be felt and the gazelle will not go there because of bad vibes. If we, when we were young, were taught to be sensitive to the vibrations, we would not find ourselves in bad relationships and bad places. But we are usually told not to go by our feelings, but to listen to what people have to say. Language was designed to hide feelings. The point is, all organisms communicate by vibrations and know if they're in a good place or a bad place by reading the vibrations. We humans have that ability, but are not trained to use that ability. When we see people, like if I look at the audience or you see us, we see people as physical particles and machines. But that's an illusion, because what we are interacting waves. That's why one person can affect another person just by being in the field. And today, physics studies the vibration, not the physical. In quantum physics, we don't study the particles, we study the waves. And we study how the wave interference. All of the waves together is called the field. So you are made out of atoms, but you also are the field. You are connected to everything because you can't separate waves. Now I'm going to show you how your thoughts go out and affect your life on the outside.
What's good this morning? Sunday fun day. And my opinion of fun is learning something new. Hope you guys like to have fun in the same way.
This is an older picture of a new technology called magnetoencephalograph, MEG. EEG, you put wires on your skin and read the brain activity. MEG, the probe does not even touch the head. You can read your brain activity outside of your head. It's not magic. Your thoughts are not contained in your head. As I talked about, people are not particles, they're waves. And waves become entangled with each other. The people that you get connected to, you are entangled with. And many people are familiar, if you think about someone or talk about someone you haven't seen for years, and I say, "Oh, I haven't seen my friend John in 10 years, and the phone rings and it's John. Or a letter comes in the mail from John. It's like the placebo, nocebo. When you think very positive thoughts of someone, they make an effort to get in touch with you. But it works both ways. If you have a negative thought about somebody, wherever they are, they will create negative talk about you. So it's very important to recognize your thoughts and your judgments are not just connected to you, they're connected to the people you talk about. So people know that if you hit the right frequency, you can cause a crystal goblet to explode. It's called harmonic resonance or constructive interference. You are like a tuning fork with your brain, and you're broadcasting frequencies of your thoughts. Which goblet is going to respond to your thoughts? The one that is harmonically resonant with your thoughts. If you live in fear, you're not going to activate the Dalai Lama, but you may get Scarface to show up. So when you are having thoughts, you are exciting and activating those things in the world that are connected to your thought. when a mugger is trying to pick out which person he's going to attack, of the different people walking down the street, which one do you think gets attacked? The one who is most afraid. Because the one who's most afraid will resonate, and that means that the mugger doesn't have to do anything and go boo, and everyone will give him everything. But while it works for individuals,
I forgot to bring my,
it is very powerful when a whole group of people have the same thoughts. You can't make a war unless enough people are ready to make a war.
I gave an art class yesterday, so my good little group of brushes that I've been working with is in my bag downstairs with everything else on the first floor. Fuck. Let me drag these supplies up here real quick so I can get started working on this painting.
I'm going to show a picture of mass action here, and it relates to in New York City 1 year after 9/11. So this is September 11th, 2002, the 1 year anniversary of 9/11. What was everybody in New York thinking about that day? The winning number, 911, because we collectively create the reality. So when you look at yourself, you're not a single entity, but you are a community of 50 trillion cells. But it's important to understand the word community. Every cell is intelligent, but when they're in a community, they give up their personal intelligence and respond to the central voice. So that the community represents a thing, one thing called an organism. And in that community, that a cell must follow what the central voice is. And if the central voice says to die, the cells will die. So the central voice is the mind. And I will be talking about the nature of the two parts of the mind and why we have trouble sometimes controlling our life. So what I would talk about is the role of how this mind works. First, there are signals from the environment, the internal and external environment. The brain, the function of the brain is to perceive the signals and then interpret those signals and then send the information to the cells to control the behavior and the genetics. So the function of the brain is perception, and from that creates the mind. Now, we have heard of something called the placebo effect, right? The placebo effect is when you have a very positive thought that something can heal you, even if you don't know it, but it's a sugar pill, but you believe it's the real medicine, then you can heal yourself with that. So the pill didn't heal you, it was the thought that healed you. Statistics reveal that 1/3 of all medical healings, including surgery, are the result of the placebo effect. Now, the issue is that the placebo effect is when you have positive thinking. What about...
Don't request a fake. Get rolling with Glint. Real is how we roll.
Look at you. You notice the details.
Medicine does not tell you is that there is negative thinking, and it's called the nocebo effect. And in the same power that positive thinking can heal you, negative thinking can kill you. They're both the same effect. One is more positive, one is more negative, but the effects are exactly the same on your health. One will heal you, and the other can make you sick. The point is that negative thinking can create all the effects of chemotherapy. Now think about this. If a doctor tells you you have a disease, or the doctor tells you you're going to die, and you believe the doctor because he's the professional, the belief will give you a disease and can cause you to die. In the United States, in the South, there's a religious group called the Baptist Fundamentalists. And this one group works themselves up into a state of ecstasy, religious ecstasy. And they believe God protects them. And so they will work with snakes, poisonous snakes like rattlesnakes, and they will even get bitten by the snake and nothing happens to them. Now look at this though. Some of them will drink strychnine in toxic doses, and when they're in that state of belief.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Welcome to Just for Laughs All Access. How are you? You good? Nice. It's nice to be here. Montreal have a big beef with Toronto. Why? Is it because they say, yeah, I don't understand. I said the last, I thought your savior of Canada was from Toronto. Your Drake. Your fucking half-handsome fucking savior. And yeah, I thought he was running through here with his woes through here. You know what sucks about that song? When I first heard it and he was talking about running through the six with his woes, I actually thought it was dope. I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then I found out woes meant friends. Not so fucking cool anymore. Why don't you just say friends? Running through the six with my friends. I'm like, all right, yeah. Yeah, I thought woes. I thought he was like sad. I thought he was like running through the six with his sadness. And that's just what he calls his fucking stupid friends. Sorry, man, I've been smoking weed all day because your city does not give a fuck for some reason. It's amazing. They don't care at all. They like it, they cheer it on. Like I went to hide it and one of the cops was like, this place is awesome. We have, I live in Brooklyn. We have anti-weed commercials. We have anti-weed, and they're all terrible. They're all really bad, and I know it's cliche to say, but to paint a picture for you, there's a couple of them. One of them is a very famous one. There's a girl, and she's with her friend, and her friend is the couch. And then she goes, my friend's a little different. And I go, yeah, she's a couch now. She didn't smoke weed and turn into a couch. Like it wasn't. She cut a hole in the couch and then took all the stuff out, and then like got in and put her head out. Listen, you just have a dumb friend. That's all. I've never taken a hit of a joint and been like, well, fucking just slither in there. Another famous weed commercial we have, there's like a bunch of kids at a basketball court, and these thugs go up to this little nerdy kid, and they're like, yo man, you wanna smoke weed? Which I've never been intimidated into smoking weed. Nobody's ever yelled at me. But always been like, hey fuckface, you wanna smoke weed? It's always been like that's it. It's as far as it goes. Always been like, hey fuckface, you wanna smoke weed? It's always been like that's it. It's as far as it goes. So thugs go up to the little kid and they're like, yo man, you wanna smoke weed? And this little kid goes, I don't smoke weed. I smoke fools like you on the b-ball court. I'm just sitting there high like, what a dumb kid, you could do both. I don't understand that. I don't have a problem with anti-weed commercials. There are negative side effects to weed. It's just like, you should just make real ones. Like, use me and my friend. Like, I'd make anti-weed commercials where it's just me and my friend, and I'm on the couch, and my friend's like, yo, Pete. Yo, Pete. Yo, what? Weed. That's the whole entire commercial. Very low budget. Very low budget. And then a follow-up commercial. Me and my buddy are at the mall. And my friend's like, oh, a Crocs store. And I go, I heard they're mighty comfortable. And then we buy Crocs. Weed. That's the entire fucking commercial. Really low budget. Really low budget. I recently got a clean bill of health. My dick's good. Really happy with that. You know that feeling, sir? You clapped right away. He's like, oh! Are you like me? Anytime I see a mark on my dick, I'm like, oh, there it is. There it is. I got it. I always think I got, it's always something little. It's always like I jerked off and like didn't wash. And then like something's gonna happen. You know, like if you fucking eat cheese doodles all day and then fucking.
Alright, this guy is not that funny.
Well, quick corrections. In my bio, it should say church and not churches, because this is the first church that I've actually done a debate in or dialectical discussion. And also, what it doesn't say is that I was a Southern Baptist for more than 25 years. So I don't know how relevant that is, but it does give people some perspective. Thanks for having me, and thanks for showing up. I really appreciate this, and thank you to Israel. I thought I've thoroughly enjoyed this. This is the kind of thing that I live for, and there are people who have commented that I seem to be different from some of the other atheists that they've seen or interacted with, and in some respects that may be true, and in others I think it's just a matter of perception. When I hear people coming up to give the sermons over the course of this lectureship, when I hear them representing the atheist position, it's almost never, at least not entirely, consistent with my own. The question tonight is God man-made? And it probably won't surprise anyone who was here last night that my answer begins with, I don't know. But it does end a little bit differently. I don't know, but I think that that's the case. And so I'll make that case, but first we need to address the burden of proof a bit more. Because there's some people who've expressed frustration, particularly with last night. Some seem to think that we're pitting two competing ideas here, one idea being God exists, and the other one is that God doesn't exist, and as I tried to point out last night, that's not the proposition that I'm here to defend. And it's frustrated some that I'm quick to respond with, I don't know. That's the honest answer, and it's the one that encourages us to go out and find the right answer. In truth, the two competing ideas here are more akin to there's good reason to believe that God exists, and I don't agree with that, or I don't agree that we can reasonably reach that conclusion. And late this afternoon, the challenge went out, where is the evidence from the atheists which disproves the Bible? And as I told Joshua after he had raised it, that is a shifting of the burden of proof. The Bible isn't just true. Oops, sorry. Yes. The Bible isn't just true right up until the point somebody disproves it. But there are people who have engaged in challenges to the Bible, questions about the Bible, pointing out what they see as contradictions. I'll get to some of that in a little bit. But on the subject of burden of proof, I used a gumball analogy last night, which I think made it clear to some. And I also talked about whether you should believe something until it's proved false, or whether you should reserve belief until such time it's been demonstrated as true, and why I support the latter. Because if you believe something until it's proved false, you're going to be believing competing ideas and things that are necessarily false. And the fact that someone can't prove that a particular claim is false doesn't mean that the claim is true. And even if I fail to convince you that God is man-made or whatever the proposition may be, that doesn't mean that God is real. Those are propositions that must stand or fall on their own merits and on the basis of the evidence supporting them. This idea that if you can't prove me wrong, I'm right, is simply not the way we demonstrate the truth of things. When we listen to the sermons, they're very convincing, especially if you already believe. And it's very difficult to spot fallacies, because picking out fallacies is difficult in conversational discussions, and it's much easier when something is formatted as a proper logical syllogism. And I wish I had time to address, and I'm sorry that this may appear insulting to some people, the many, many, many fallacies that I've heard over the last couple of days, because I think it would be helpful. There's so much content, and I watch the DVDs that are being recorded, and try to take the claims and put them into a syllogism. Do some research if you don't understand about logical syllogisms. I'm not trying to push anything over anybody's head. I'm not necessarily smarter than anybody, although I've read and studied quite a bit. If you made a list of every god that has ever been claimed to exist, it would cover the walls inside here. Which would be kind of sacrilegious, I agree. But there lots of them. And those are just named gods that people have proposed that they exist. And by and large, if you ask most people, they would look at all of those gods and say that they're man-made, except for the one that they believe in. My God is not man-made. My God is real. These others are man-made. Now, there may be other explanations that all these other gods exist as non-gods, or that these are human people. But the concepts, generally, we would identify as these are man-made. This is a false god, the flying spaghetti monster, Thor. You know, obviously somebody had a failure in reasoning, needed an explanation. Put Thor in there and you're done. The interesting thing is that for any given god on that list, there are many different believers in that god who each have a different god concept in their head. Their internal model of that god is going to be different. For example, the biblical God is cited by many as their God, but even for that category, that appears to be one God, there are many different God concepts, which is why you can have so many different Christian denominations, or denominations that identify as Christian, and why you can have different God concepts even within the Church of Christ, or the Baptists, and why you end up with Southern Baptists and Southern Baptists of 1893, and the Reformation of this, it goes on forever. There's a really good joke from Emo Phillips in there. But it's worse than that, because even when we get down to a single denomination, a single group of a denomination, a single church, a single pew, the two people sitting right there could have different God concepts in their heads, and most likely do. I'll get back to that point a little bit later. Given that that's the case, and given that we live in a world where the most probable determinant of what your religion is going to be is what your parents' religions were and where you were born. Not stating that they're false because you were born into it, but that's just a fact. If your parents are Muslims, you're probably going to be a Muslim. Given all of that, what is the likelihood that you managed to find the one true God out of all the other man-made gods? Seems pretty low to me. More than that, though, we don't know how likely it is that any of them are actually true. It's possible, it's impossible for all of those gods to be real, because they're mutually contradictory. They have different properties and different claims about them. But it is possible, so far as I can tell, that they're all false. So not only do you have to come up with the odds that you've picked the right one, but you also have to find a way to demonstrate that there is a right one. And I don't know how anybody could demonstrate that. We know for a fact that men have created gods. And I don't even think that this is in dispute. I'd be surprised if Israel disputed it. It's one of the things that we just see. If not flying spaghetti monster, okay, it's not proposed as a real god by some, although they're wearing colanders on their head on their driver's licenses now, which I find to be kind of absurd. And yes, there are people who identify Jedi as their religion, but there are other man-made religions. There are other man-made gods. Now, why have men, I would say, and women, but let's be honest about the history, it's mostly men doing this, created gods? What's the reason? Well, we don't have a good answer that is complete because we don't have a time machine. We can't go back and say, why'd they come up with that idea? But we can speculate, and we can come up with good explanations. The most common, and the ones that I find most reasonable to me, are that gods are offered as a way to explain things that we don't understand, and to assuage our fears of the unknown and fears of dying. Many times this weekend, I've heard that the world is consistent with what we'd expect if the God of the Bible is real. I disagree, but I might have a different concept of the God of the Bible than you do. But consistency isn't surprising, because if we have invented a God to serve as an explanation for what we observe, then of course what we observe is going to be consistent with that God. Otherwise, it doesn't serve any purpose as an explanation. If we don't understand how something works and we invent a God to explain how it works, it doesn't do us any good to look back at the thing that we were trying to explain and say, look, this is consistent with a God. Of course it is. That's why we manufactured the God in the first place. Consistency is irrelevant in this context. And let's not take me out of context there. It's a meaningless panacea when we invent a God that can do anything and be anything. It serves as an answer to every question and an explanation for nothing, because it has no explanatory power. It's attempting to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. And that's not the way we gain understanding about the universe. It's frustrating to hear things like, look at the trees, or the mere fact that you're standing here is evidence of God. No, it isn't. It's evidence that I'm standing here. The existence of a thing is not in and of itself evidence for any specific cause. The causal link must be established and demonstrated. As we talked about a little bit about last night with design, you don't just get to call it a beaver dam, you've got to actually demonstrate it. And calling me a creation isn't true until it's been demonstrated. If I am a creation, then I'll agree I have a creator. But until you demonstrate that that's the case, you can't just say, oh, just the fact that you're standing here is proof of God. Now, you folks love the Bible. I mean, you really love the Bible. And I don't say that in insulting. This is just awesome, because last night it was the Bible, the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. There's a book for that. And this is probably, I would say, one of a couple of different areas where we immediately part company and it affects everything else we discuss. Because I don't find the Bible reliable. We keep hearing about how it's the most authenticated book, but that to me is meaningless, because how authenticated is it? If it turns out that the most authenticated book is 1% authenticated, well then telling me it's the most authenticated book is telling me nothing. I need something more, something about how authenticated it is. How reliable is it? Israel cited 6,000 manuscripts. We don't have autographs, we don't have originals. And some of those are fragments the size of a credit card, but none of that matters. Because when we talk about authentication, the fact that the Bible gets some verifiable facts correct, some place names, some information about history, is utterly unremarkable and unimpressive to me. And just because it gets those facts right doesn't mean that it also gets the facts right about the extraordinary claims that it makes. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I'll get to David Hume in a while, who's, if there's any philosopher who I consider the pinnacle of philosophy and modern thought, it's David Hume, and everybody should read it. But each of the claims need their own supporting evidence. If archaeologists in 3,000 years find evidence of New York, that doesn't mean that Spider-Man was real. And I don't say that in an insulting way. It's just a way of extrapolating and demonstrating by analogy that just because some event occurred in Jerusalem that we can verify doesn't mean that the same book that tells you that story is also correct, that somebody walked on water or raised people from the dead. Those are claims that require additional evidence. We heard last night how miracles are done in the Church of Christ view, that we're no longer getting miracles because they were there to confirm the word, which means that we don't have the epistemic justification that those people who reported the miracles had. We have to trust them. We have to trust these people who claim that they saw stuff. I can't do that. I can't trust that somebody reported, oh, I saw this amazing thing. I may believe that they believe it. I may believe that they're sincere, but I don't believe that they have come to the correct conclusion or that they are portraying sufficient evidence. We talked about, I heard a little bit about prophecy today, and wow, there's way too much. How much time do I have? I'm almost to 10, wow. So on prophecy, I'll just say, there's lots of disputes about prophecy, and if you want to find out why, talk to some Jews about why they don't accept the messianic prophecies, etc., and I'll let the different doctrines dispute those things. But the fact that a prediction or claim ultimately came true does not tell you why it came true. It doesn't. There was an assertion today that the best possible, the only remaining explanation is that this was God. I don't know how we concluded that. Look at any given claim. How did you determine that it wasn't luck? Probably not. Wasn't a wild guess. Wasn't an educated guess. especially if you're making a prediction about war. It's just a few years before the war. If there's turmoil, that seems to be kind of an educated guess. We haven't ruled out time travel. I mean, everybody's going to go, what? Time travel? Are you nuts? I don't know that it's impossible. I don't know what the explanation is for why a particular claim may or may not have come true. And when people claim that they do know why, I want to see the evidence for why that is. And if the claim is that, well, there just couldn't be any other way, I'm not buying it. There was some quote about Peter, professing that these were eyewitnesses, and we're not just following a constructed fable. Well, of course you're going to hear that. If you believed you were following a constructed fable, you probably wouldn't believe it anymore. But nobody is going to say, yeah, we are just following a constructed fable. The mere fact that somebody claims that they're not doesn't mean they're correct. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're sincere, but I'm happy to think that they are. Hume taught us a couple of things. Revelation is necessarily first person. To everybody else, it's hearsay. And it's not the same quality of evidence. He also taught us to reject the greater miracle. And he said famously that if somebody comes to me and tells me that a man was raised from the dead, I have to consider which is more likely, that this individual is deceived or deceiving, or that the event actually happened, and I need to reject the greater miracle. There was a passage cited from Deuteronomy about prophets, and that you know them by their fruit, essentially another version of that, and that what the passage actually says is if somebody comes forth and prophesies the name of God and it doesn't come to pass, then that's a false prophet. But what that passage doesn't say, which was implied and actually I think stated, is that if what they say does come to pass, that they're a true prophet. That passage doesn't say that, and it would be logically false to conclude that that's the case. We talk about eyewitnesses. Now, when it comes to the Bible, we can argue whether or not we actually have eyewitnesses or not. I don't really care, because we know that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. How many people are familiar with the story of Betty and Barney Hill, who claimed to be abducted by aliens? There's some parallels to this story, and I won't get into the whole thing, but when I hear from one of the common apologetics is, appealing to the witness of Mary and how unrealistic it would be that if somebody were trying to deceive people, that they would have a woman be the representative. And I think we could argue that if somebody were trying to deceive about aliens in the 60s, it'd be unlikely that they'd have an interracial couple be the representatives of truth. I mean, we could maybe draw some parallels, though. But you can actually meet real people right now who will tell you their alien abduction story. They'll portray it. They seem sincere. Their stories are consistent with other people who claim to have abducted. Do we believe them? I don't. I may believe that they're sincere. I may believe that they're confused, but I don't believe the truth of the foundational premise that they're talking about. When I talk about why I don't accept the Bible, there are lots of reasons, and I've heard this weekend that it's perfect, infallible, without contradiction, and that no one has shown otherwise, which is shifting the burden of proof. And yet I'll point you to the Skeptic's Annotated Bible and infidels.org, which list have a massive collection of listed proposed contradictions and absurdities. I don't accept all of them. I think some of them are dumb, but others are more difficult. But the problem is, whenever I raise these, the response I get is very similar to the response I got last night. You just don't understand the Bible. You don't understand the Bible. The Bible properly interpreted, the Bible read correctly, the Bible understood correctly. These are the things that we get, and yet there's no demonstration of the method one would use to properly understand or interpret the Bible, apart from continuing to appeal to the Bible or saying, oh, we'll find out when it's true. That is not a methodology for determining truth, and it's the reason we have so many different denominations within Christianity and even divisions within the Church of Christ, because you think you've got the right answer and they think they've got the right answer, and there is no demonstrated mechanism for finding out. And by the way, just pick one little doctrinal thing, the requirement of baptism for salvation. I mean, I don't know enough about what you've discussed about this, but basically, everybody who doesn't believe that, I'm presuming they're damned. And so for thousands of years, or 1,800 years, until somebody found the right interpretation, everybody else had it wrong. No matter how sincere they were, no matter how much they were trying to promote Christ, no matter how much they were trying to encourage others to come to Christ, no matter how devout they were, they all got it wrong. And yet God didn't seem to offer any correction. And yet there came a correct interpretation by some people's minds. Men have invented gods, and some people think that theirs is the only one that wasn't invented. But we look at this scientifically. We've hooked people up to an fMRI, a way of scanning the brain, and we ask questions. And you can ask people questions. What do you think about this? And a part of the brain will light up anytime they're talking about what they think. And if you say, what does Joe Blow think about this? Another part of the brain will light up in response to that question, because now they're not thinking about what they would do. They are putting themselves in the position of some other thinking agent and saying, what would this person think about it? And so you can ask people these questions. What would you do about this? Boom. What would Joe do about this? Boom. Which side lights up when you ask them what God thinks? This side. The side that refers to self. That's confirmation that we each invent a God of our own creation. We have our own internal model. Whether or not it maps to an actual God is still an open question. Whether or not you can come up with an apologetic that says, oh, well, the reason this side lights up is because God is so intricately tuned to us that we don't even think of him as another being, and so, of course, we're thinking with ourselves. And yet, curiously, that doesn't solve a problem at all. Because what we see and what we observe is that when people think about what does God think, they're using the side of the brain that is about what they think. And that would be okay if they were consistent and in agreement, but they're not. So given the number of potential gods out there, the ones that we know were man-made, and that we can't determine if any of them were in fact man-made, and the fact that each individual has their own God concept, which seems, by all available evidence, to consistently agree with them, which is how we end up in these disputes. My position is that the most reasonable conclusion is that gods are man-made. Are they intentional fictions constructed by people? No. I think some of them probably are. I'm not the cynical religions and gods were invented to control the masses and keep the people down, and only the opium of the masses and stupid people believe this. I was a Christian for 25 years. My IQ didn't go up when I stopped believing. I don't think Christians are stupid. Otherwise, I'd think I was stupid. I like myself way too much to think I was stupid. But I do think I was wrong. I do think I was mistaken. And I know that I was sincere. When I hear people talk about, was God a human invention? I don't think of it as an intentional machination to control or construct something. I look at it more as simple errors in thinking, simple errors in reasoning. We need an explanation for this. We can't come up with one. We don't currently have one. We are incredibly frustrated that we don't have one. Hey, wait, this God can do anything, which means we can plug it in as an explanation for anything. And the universe will be consistent with that, because that's exactly why we proffered it in the first place. But my concern is whether or not it's real. And if you start with a blank slate, if you start without any presuppositions, it's difficult, it's virtually impossible to get rid of all of your baggage. But if you try, and you say, nope, I'm going to set down the Bible, and I'm not going to begin with the assumption that it's correct. And instead, I'm going to try to prove that it's correct. Or instead, I'm going to try to explore this and then come back and find out if what the Bible had to say is consistent with what I found. That's fine. And if that's where you end up, God bless you. But I need actual evidence of a God. And as far as I can tell, the most reasonable conclusion is that we have invented gods, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally, as the result of the normal way we think. Lots of appeals to common sense this weekend. Common sense is wrong a lot. Common sense gets us into trouble. It's the reason that we rely on reason. It's the reason that we want sound epistemologies. It's the reason that when we're in a court of law trying to determine whether or not a God exists, and the prosecution is claiming that the God exists, my position is not guilty. I find God not guilty of existence. Every God that's been proposed, not guilty. Doesn't mean I think they're innocent. Doesn't mean I'm asserting that there are no gods. Like I said, it's an unfalsifiable proposition. I can't prove that gods don't exist. That's not where the burden of proof rests. And I can't prove that any specific God is necessarily a man-made fiction. But I have to go with what I find most reasonable. And given the weight of the evidence from the broader world, not just appealing to one holy book or one tradition, or whether or not something happens to be consistent with reality, I have to come to the conclusion that the most reasonable position is that gods are man-made. And this is not something that I claim as an absolute certainty, which we kind of talked about absolute certainty last night. But thanks.
Certainly is good to be with each of you tonight and to join Matt in this second night of discussion concerning what I consider to be the most meaningful questions of human existence. Last night, as we dealt with the question, what is more rational, an eternal God or eternal matter, I made the statement that when we think about all of the knowledge that we have accumulated over the course of existence, then man has systematized that knowledge into certain categories that we
This man says systematize.
label philosophy. Philosophy is the study of wisdom, and the thought as all of the knowledge that we have accumulated over the course of existence, then man has systematized that knowledge into certain categories that we label philosophy. Philosophy is the study of wisdom, and the 5 basic tenets of philosophy are metaphysics. It deals with the matter of origins. Epistemology, that deals with how we know what we know. Logic, which deals with the science or the art of correct reasoning. Ethics, that answers the question, how should we live, or is there a way that we ought to live? And then aesthetics, that deals with art and beauty. And I was careful to make the point that if we fail to get our metaphysics right, then everything else will be wrong. Our epistemology, our logic, our ethics, and our aesthetics. And consequently, our life will not make sense because we function based on reason. And reason's first and most profound and meaningful question is, where did I come from? If I cannot answer that question, which Mr. Delahunty has already said, I don't know, and he began today with, I don't know, then there is no way he can know how to reason, because one's metaphysics directly affects one's epistemology. We reason from the known to the unknown. But like I said yesterday, when we think about just the very word reason or rationality or rational, it implies that we have a mind that is able to think, understand, and form judgments logically. The very word logic means that there is a particular system that involves the principles of proof and inference. And all of those operations exist within a construct called consciousness. And if we do not know where consciousness came from or how consciousness arose, again, where did mind come from if the claim is there was mud first? Does mud produce mind? Where did reason or rationality come from if the claim is rocks were here first? Do rocks create rationality? And so once we begin to think on these lines, we will be able to see that it is very difficult to make an argument based on reason when we don't even know where reason came from. We get that wrong, everything else is wrong. And so as we summarized yesterday, we came to the conclusion that What is more rational, at least from my perspective, is an eternal God. Because God is the answer the Bible gives me. And it's not just because the Bible gives me that answer, it's because of all of the evidence that supports the Bible. Now, time obviously will not permit me to go through everything to demonstrate that conclusively, but when we think about God, God becomes a logical necessity. Without him, we would not make sense. And when we talk about evidence, we have to keep in mind that there are two types of evidence. There is the evidence that is empirical in nature, evidence that appeals to the five senses, but there is evidence that is wholly in the mind. It is a logical procession of thoughts that lead to a particular conclusion. God cannot be proven empirically, but he can and is proven logically. It was Immanuel Kant, a great philosopher of time gone by, who coined the word phenomenon. And we would say that God is a great phenomenon. But he also coined the term noumenon, to distinguish what happens in the physical world and how we experience the physical world through our senses, as opposed to what happens in the mind and what happens in the mind in formulating judgments ultimately through logic. It must go through thinking and understanding. And so you have both noumenon and phenomenon. In their plural form, it's noumena and phenomena. But the point is this: God is a logical necessity in order for everything else to make sense. Because without God, then you can never explain where consciousness came from. If you cannot explain where consciousness came from, you cannot explain life, because in order to reason back to the conclusion of where life came from, you need consciousness. And as we begin to think about these things very carefully, very meticulously, no one who understands the questions as the questions we are answering tonight is going to say that God can be proved empirically. God is proved logically. It is a logical argument that the Bible makes. Now, as we think about the question tonight, and we're moving basically from metaphysics to epistemology, the question tonight is God a human invention? Now I ask you, how is that possible, that God to be a human invention, if the human mind is incapable of inventing God in the first place? Last night, Mr. Delahunty made a very telling affirmation, a very telling declaration. He said, when we look at nature, there is no thing that tells us about God. We cannot look at nature and from nature reason to God. Now, if that's the case from a purely naturalistic standpoint, where then did I get the concept of God? Because from a naturalist standpoint, and some of the greatest mental philosophers of our day, John Locke, and Mr. Delahunty mentioned also David Hume, English philosopher and Scottish philosophers. These were renowned men of their day, and we still use their systems to this day. John Locke influenced the government of the United States of America. The very documents upon which this great nation is founded was influenced by the teachings of John Locke. And of course, David Hume in his own right gave us a very systematic teaching about how understanding and consciousness and all of these things work. Did you know that both of them tell us that the mind begins, as John Locke would say, a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that through empirical stimulation, the mind perceives objects external to itself, and these objects, as they are accessed through our senses, concepts are created in the mind. So we begin as a blank slate, and by what we see, we begin to develop concepts, and over time we build a frame of reference. If it is the case that in nature nothing represents God, I ask the question, where did the idea of God come from? Man does not have the mental power to invent God. He does not have the mental acuity to begin to reason to the point that there is a God if all he has, if all she has is nature. We have to ultimately understand that there is another source of information. Somewhere down the stream of time, God had to influence the course of human history by introducing himself. And once the concept of God was introduced to creation, only then did man, as he and she began to corrupt themselves and their civilizations, did false gods become invented. But as we reason all the way back to the beginning, there is no way possible, given the model of a naturalist, an atheist, a skeptic, an agnostic, many different terms, and I understand that there are distinct differences, nuances of differences, but the point is, if we think that all we have is nature, we could never have invented the idea of God. God had to introduce himself. Now, all of this boils down to one's chronology, how we measure time. And it's interesting that chronology is the science of measuring time. And so, in some ways, if we understand the word science and how it's used here in connection to time, God can be proved scientifically only in the sense that he's proved chronologically. Of all the data that is available to us today, there is only one document that takes us all the way back to the beginning. Can you guess what that document is? It is the Bible. And so long as the Bible is understood with regard to its transmission, its translation, and then once we scrutinize and come to a conclusion with regard to its truthfulness, we then can develop a trust based upon the testimony that is given to us. And I find it, I was taken aback when Mr. Delahunty made the statement, don't ask me to trust somebody. I can't trust somebody. Now that's all fine and good when we're talking about other people, especially in this situation, but I ask myself, well, how then do you trust your wife? If you can't trust people, how do you trust your wife? How do you trust the people at the bank who take care of your money? How do you trust your automobile to get you from point A to point B as you enter into it? How do you even trust your own senses to be able to determine truth if that's the case? As human beings, we are hardwired for sociality. And do you know what the undergirding trait of sociality is in order for it to function properly? Trust. If there is no trust and we cannot trust, then that's tantamount to saying, I can't believe anything. But when we put it in terms of trusting people of ancient days who wrote things, then we want to pick and choose how we use that term, and we'll see how he responds in just a moment. Now, he also made some statements with regard to evidence, and he was appealing to Deuteronomy 18, a section of scripture that was given earlier today. But in Deuteronomy 18, it does not say that if these things did not occur as God said, then it was not God. Go and read Deuteronomy 18, 15 and following, and there it will show you that it does say that if this thing did not come to pass, it's because God did not say it. And this is the criterion, at least in this area, of determining what is truth from what is falsehood. So as we begin to look at these things, we have to understand that the only way man could invent God is if God first introduced the concept himself. Now, when we begin to look at history, the evidence external to the Bible takes us back to about 3500 BC. And there we can begin to analyze these things. And we begin with the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. There we have the Sumerians. From them, we go into, of course, the Ur of Chaldees, which was one aspect of the Sumerians that we know about that is confirmed not only extra-biblically, but biblically. From them, we move to the Egyptians. From the Egyptians, we turn our attention to the Assyrians. From the Assyrians, we go to the Babylonians. From the Babylonians, we go to the Persians. From the Persians, we go to the Greeks. From the Greeks, we go to the Romans. All of this is verifiable extra-biblically. The Bible only supports or runs parallel with what we can determine even in the documents of human history. And guess what? In 1995, a very noted archaeologist of Germany discovered a place called the Göbekli Tepe. And this particular place has fascinated scientists and archaeologists all over the world. I challenge you and I encourage you to go and look at these things in YouTube, and you can Google them, Wikipedia. Göbekli Tepe. In 1995, they discovered this area in a part of the world where a large area has been discovered of containing underground an ancient civilization. And from 1995 until today, which has almost been 2 decades, they've only excavated a very small percentage of this ancient civilization. Now, our best scientists, our best archaeologists from all over the world have tested and measured these things, and they say that it dates to a time when, in the secularists' chronology, human beings should be in what they call the Stone Age. The Flintstones. Do you remember how we, in a very light way, depict human society in the Stone Age? At that particular time, they were saying that we were very, very close to the beasts of the earth, and we were still unlearned in many different ways. Whereas in the Flintstone cartoon, they already had the wheel. According to secular chronology, in the Stone Age, they had not even invented the wheel. And in this site, the Göbekli Tepe, that they found, they discovered such a sophisticated civilization that it defies the scientific thinking, especially as it relates to the secular chronology that has been placed there by geologists and others. At this time, people should be basically dumb and should be walking around grunting. And yet they have a very sophisticated system of living. And guess what part they accidentally discovered of this society? It was their place of worship. these people were already worshiping gods. And what's interesting, as they began to analyze this, as they excavated many areas in this region, we are told that they already even had a system of agriculture, though they were only hunters. They were not farmers yet, according to the chronology. And so this disrupts the entire thinking of a person who views time only from a secular perspective.
That messes up the religious time frame too. Like, I'm sitting up here because I've listened to a lot on Göbekli Tepe, and it's like it is going against everything modern mainstream archaeology and historians say about the evolution of modern societies. And Göbekli Tepe is fucking everything up. But how are you trying to compare that to the Bible and saying, oh, the secular linear way of thinking about time and evolution is wrong because Göbekli Tepe is at a time period where mankind shouldn't have been able to erect such edifices? But at the same time, bro, the Bible says that the world is only 6,000 years old, and the archaeologists are dating Göbekli Tepe to 12,000 years ago. So it doesn't fit the biblical time frame or the secular time frame. It's fucking everything up. So I want to see how he puts his spin on the Bible reason for Göbekli Tepe being an advanced culture, an advanced civilization that already had the technology, the engineering, and the capabilities to build such a intricate city. But yeah, it's older than the Bible, and he himself even said they had a temple of worship where they were worshiping gods, multiple gods. And so how do you go from polytheism to monotheism if God revealed himself in order to give mankind the concept of what he is? Then the earliest civilization should have only had a monotheistic view of God that had revealed himself, instead of having the God of the earth and the God of the wind and the God of the seas and the forest, and having multiple gods. Because multiple gods is way older than the monotheistic view of a creator.
When we follow the Bible, we begin right. We entertain what happened between the beginning and the end, but we most certainly will end right as well, as long as we remain consistent, especially as it relates to chronology. Is God of human invention? The answer is yes and no. Because logically, God, the true God, must have interjected himself somewhere in the stream of time so that man could take that concept and then corrupt it to invent other gods. And this is the yes part, or the yes answer to this question. No, God cannot be invented by the human mind.
And this God being corrupted and turned into other gods, like, if God is the God of the Bible, the all-powerful, the all-knowing, the all-seeing, like, wouldn't he see that happen? Wouldn't he have already foreknown that, oh, they're going to take the concept of me and make false gods? But I already know that, so it's a part of my grand plan. And everything that seems like kind of fucked up, or seems like God really doesn't have an answer, or seems like God let some bullshit happen, and then it's like, well, that's all a part of God's plan. That's his master plan. It's like, really? To fuck up over and over? You just keep messing it up. I'm sorry I keep talking over the preacher, but I mean, like, I know they're going to finish the debate and actually have a back and forth, but even me, I can see like holes in his theory and how he's trying to get people to think. And it's like, dude, nobody's falling for it anymore. Well, a lot of people are falling for it, but and am I all the way with the atheist group saying there is no God? No. My thing is, I guess I'm a deist, and the atheists don't like that either because you can't prove it. And of course, you can't prove God. Like they're all saying, is like it's improvable. But I think the God of the Bible is an invented God, and the true life force, original energy source, supreme consciousness, whatever you want to call it, it's bigger than the God concept. It's bigger than a bunch of old letters and poems and scriptures written down by some fucking dudes a couple thousand years ago. You know, it's like that. The God of the Bible is not my own personal concept of God. Like, and once you do some history and do some research and know how the Bible was constructed and how the Bible was put together and who and why the Old Testament and the New Testament are put in one book, and then you'll be like, oh, okay, this is kind of made up. Bacon bits. Oh, bacon bits. I got some new shoes.
Which logically means, and it takes us back to last night's question, there must have been something there to begin with. Because we have something today that directly implies that there has always been something. You cannot begin by thinking that nothing was here to begin with. That's a wrong model. There has always been something, and there will always be something, because something now is. And if something now is, there had to be a first something that is uncaused, outside of space and time, that gave rise to everything else. We cannot say that that's God directly. We don't jump from that logical conclusion to God until we come to terms with His revealing, with His inspired word. And God doesn't just say, hey, you need to believe in me, you need to accept what I say. God says, come, let us reason together. Mr. Dillahunty wanted to make it seem like, well, I'm God and you better listen to me. God says, I'm God, and here's the evidence for my existence. An evidence that demonstrates that I'm not only all-powerful, all-knowing, present everywhere at once, immutable, eternal, holy, but most importantly, I'm a God of love and compassion. And is it possible for people to be sincere and yet wrong? It most certainly is. Mr. Dillahunty believes that just because a person is sincere...
No. I'm rocking another pair of N1 socks. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I got on some N1 socks. I gotta take a piss. I'll show you my new shoes. This dude right here is pissing me off because you keep going back to this, we don't know, and I'm getting a phone call. Hello? I love you too. All right, bye. My sister's calling to wish me a happy birthday. Oh shit. Check these motherfuckers out. They I don't know what that shit is. Air 27C or some shit. I don't know. But these motherfuckers is comfortable as hell. The boy said he got new shoes. And they white, so they gonna get fucked up fast as hell. That shit's hot though. I was choosing between these, and there was another pair that were kind of similar, but the laces came down further, and it had a strap that came across it. But the other pair, man, them shits was fucking like twice as heavy as these. And like these shits I'm rocking now, these New Balance, man, these shits right here so fucking light and motherfucking comfortable, yo. These shoes right here feel almost the same way, yo. Them shits feel so fucking just comfy and light, yo. The other shits, I think the other shoes, the design was better. I like the way they looked a little bit better than these. Like I say, because it had a fucking strap going across the front and all that shit. But them shits was, it was a noticeable weight difference. Like, extremely noticeable. Like, yo, these shits feel like boots compared. The other shoes felt like boots compared to these. It's like, damn, got some weight to it. I got these shoes, and I got a new a Psycho Bunny polo shirt. Psycho Bunny shits. That's the second one I got. So them shits like $100 a pop, and them the cheap ones. Like the cheap ones are $100, and that's just for the polo. Like if you try to get a Psycho Bunny goddamn sweater, a long sleeve shirt, or motherfucking a hoodie or something, man, them shit's like $200, $250 for that shit. Oh, thank you. Oh, that boy 38 years old today. Nigga said I had a birthday. I had my birthday today. What you doing on your birthday? Shit, same shit I did yesterday. Nothing. I'm going here working this goddamn painting that I should have had done. Where you gonna turn up on your birthday? Bitch, I turn up every day. In the studio. I turn up some education on your ass. Oh, you already know it. Yeah, my sister 2 years older than me, so she hit 40 this year. I'm trying to see it. I'm trying to see 90. Fuck that. Let me get some of these life extension therapies and shit like that. I'm trying to see 120. Shit. That's the birthday gift right there. I saw another year. Nigga, I come from the 90s. Motherfuckers like me, we weren't supposed to see 25. We supposed to be in jail for life, shot up and shit. You know what I'm saying? Statistics. My generation was rough, yo. I lost a lot of homies before 25. Like that, we wasn't supposed to make it. for a long time, shit, the black man was on the endangered species list. Whew, I made it through that shit though. I'm old enough, shit. I'm getting gray hairs and shit. Never thought I'd see a gray hair. It's amazing. Life is beautiful. You know what I'm saying? Life is beautiful. I done went around the sun 38 times. Boy, like, what? I feel like an astronaut. You know, I done been around the sun 38 times. I'm trying to do this shit some more. I like it a lot. Munchies kicking in. Munchies. 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 Let me stop fucking around. I gotta paint, yo.
That separates him or her from any moral responsibility. One can be sincere and be sincerely wrong. Even the Bible in the book of Romans chapter 10, verses 1 and following, there the Apostle Paul had to tell the Romans who had trouble with worshiping false gods that it was not enough to have a zeal for God. One had to have a zeal for God plus a correct knowledge of God. Just because one is sincere in his or her pursuit doesn't mean that they get a pass. Oh, you're sincere? Okay. We're going to overlook you. Try that argument with the officers. You're driving down the street and he pulls you over and he says, hey, buddy, you were speeding. There were no signs. I didn't see a speed limit posted. But I'm really sincere in my driving, and can you just let me pass this time? I said that one time to a police officer. He goes, that's not my decision. And he wrote out the ticket. Sincerity is all well and fine, but that does not mean that we cannot be wrong or that automatically gives us a pass. And so to summarize, is God a human invention? He cannot be a human invention because man has no power to invent him. And if we want to get into a discussion of the power of imagination, then we can do that, because imagination has no creative powers. Imagination begins with what's already inputted, and it only reconstructs and recombines. And so I can imagine a pig with wings, but I first must see a pig, and I must know what wings are to construct that. Where did I ever get a concept of God if all I have is nature? That is a logical, irrefutable position. Somewhere down the stream of time, God had to interject himself, and then man, because of his position and his often rebellion of God, rebellion against God, he then created other gods. And so the Egyptians worshipped over 80 different gods. The Sumerians worshipped different gods. And God revealed himself in a time where the world was polytheistic and he was calling for one God.
I'm glad we agree we can be sincere and sincerely wrong. It's the one thing.
Wait.
So basically,
See, I just caught him in something my damn self again. God revealed himself in a time when the world was polytheistic to let it be known that he was the one true God. But if the world was polytheistic and everybody worshipped many gods before God revealed himself, how do you keep saying that the mind of man can't invent God? You said that man cannot invent God because we don't have a basis. I can think of a pig with wings because I've seen a pig and I know what wings are. Man can't create God because he doesn't have a concept of God or anything close to it just by observing nature. But then you said God revealed himself when the world was polytheistic. Then how did man already have the concept of many gods before God revealed himself?
Them created other gods. And so the Egyptians worshipped over 80 different gods. The Sumerians worshipped different gods. And God revealed himself in a time where the world was polytheistic and he was calling for one God.
I'm glad we agree we can be sincere and sincerely wrong. It's the one thing we both said. So basically the argument is that man can't possibly create a God. And I find that patently false. See, the only thing that you need to be able to create a God is, hey, I'm a man, and I can do certain things. And I can then envision a Superman who can do those things better. And from there, I can envision a Superman, and it is simply a logical progression to say, is it possible that there's some being that could do everything and do it perfectly? The idea that we couldn't conceive of this is something that I just find baffling and absurd. The fact that we can't conceive of it properly may be the case, because we have a very difficult time grasping infinities and vastness. And when we talk about, the various, some of the God models that have the various omni characteristics, obviously we don't know what it's like to be omnipotent, and yet we still have this concept where we can approximate it. It's absolutely trivial to begin with, here's this. What happens if we make it better, if we make it faster, if we make it stronger, if we make it greater, have more capabilities? By his model, how did we ever conceive of magic? I don't recall having to witness magic in order to be able to conceive of it. He referenced last night he pointed out that I said, I don't trust anyone. That's not remotely what I said. That's not even close. It's not even the same ballpark. I said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I cannot take a person's word as the sole source of evidence for an extraordinary claim. If you tell me you have a pet dog, I'm happy to take your word for it, because I have plenty of evidence that we have dogs and that people keep them as pets. If you tell me you have a pet fire-breathing dragon, I'm not just going to take your word for it. I'm going to need more than that. I trust people all the time. The other thing that Hume taught us is that the wise man, and he should have said wise person, apportions their belief to the evidence, that your level of confidence in a particular idea should be proportional to the evidence that supports it. And likewise, I think this applies to trust. I trust my wife because I have good reason to. Does that mean that I can't be wrong? Of course not. Does it mean she couldn't deceive me? Nope. But I trust her. What do you mean you trust her? Do you trust her implicitly with everything? Well, no. Not to... if I bought a new Maserati, I wouldn't trust her with it. And it's because she has a driving phobia in traffic and stuff. I mean, it's just a bad idea. I have evidence that it's a bad way to do, but I trust her. We talk about the senses. How can you trust your senses? And there's this idea in philosophy about the senses being properly basic, and it's one that, depending on the context, I accept or reject, and I'm not going to go into the deep philosophy about properly basic beliefs. But the thing is, we know our senses aren't trustworthy. They are not implicitly correct. They are not absolute in that sense of trust. And we can determine how good they are and how bad they are. How many people got glasses on? That's because we can tell how good your eyes are. We can tell when they're trustworthy and when they're not. Optical illusions, our ability for our brain to perceive reality, is often confused. And how we do this, people, set a bottle of Coke in front of me, and I look at it and I say, my eyes tell me that that's a bottle of Coke. Is that enough? Can I just trust my eyes? What if I only have one eye and I don't have depth perception? No. All of your senses in concert demonstrate the reliability and the unreliability of those senses. Similarly, it's the reason science makes use of peer review. Because what I saw when I did the experiment in the lab may not be the same thing that you see. And so it's up to you to investigate it and verify that I did in fact get it right, or demonstrate that I got it wrong. This just trusting of the senses, I mean, it's not anything that we even worry about. Now, I took a terrible note there. I don't even know what it says. The idea that I have this concept that God says you must worship in this simplistic idea. Of course not. If God said that I must worship, I'd worship. Well, actually, I wouldn't. But I believe that God existed because God said so. I don't have any evidence that God has said anything. What I have are a bunch of people claiming that God said something. And I don't have sufficient evidence for that extraordinary claim to trust that when they tell me God said this, that they're correct. I don't know what the claim was that I was trying to avoid moral responsibility. I guess we'll deal with that tomorrow, because nothing I said even came close to denying moral responsibility. But this idea that you don't get a pass, that when I was talking about that people could sincerely believe, well, I understand. If there's a rule and you violate it, you know, if God actually has as a requirement, let's say baptism for salvation, and you didn't follow that rule, you broke the rule, and God can do whatever he wants with you. My objection was actually a little bit more about whether or not this is a reasonable proposition, that all of these other people who got it wrong weren't doing what they should do to get it right. It's about the methodology of how you get to that conclusion. And quite frankly, the speed limit isn't up for interpretation. I don't have to interpret the speed limit correctly. It's not a wavering thing. And so when I get pulled over, whether I knew the speed limit or not is different from whether, in order for me to know about the speed limit, I would have had to read through the law and properly interpret it, and other people may have interpreted it in different ways, and we have countless citizens who are saying, no, it's actually 42, no, it's 43, no, it's 85, and we have no demonstrated method, nothing to actually cite that's clear to everybody. If it has to be interpreted, it is necessarily subject to human error. What kind of wise being would establish a system and write down their most important words in ancient books that die off and get translated and depend on people interpreting or right, fallible beings? One of the questions that I'll ask you tomorrow, I'll give you a preview when we talk about morality, is as a fallible being, if there was a God and a devil, they are both far more powerful than I am, and both have the capability of fooling me, and I'm not sure how I could distinguish between the two of them. So I'm wondering how it is that people have come to the conclusion that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one, because you seem to be judging them both by their own standards. And as a fallible being, how do you know you've come to the right answer? And if you keep just pointing back to, well, God has to be the good one, yeah, but how do you know that? But I guess we'll save that for tomorrow.
Well, I want to spend some time thinking about his first comment there, and that is that he's never heard or never thought of how you need to see something first, perceive it before it exists in the mind. He mentioned Superman, and he mentioned magic. Now, this, of course, is understanding that when man did invent the concept of a Superman, which Mr. Delahunty cannot pinpoint when that happened. As far as we know, we are dependent on the records to tell us when man began to invent the idea of God, and God is much, much more superior than what we would understand as Superman. As a matter of fact, Superman, for me, is something very different than for someone older in the audience, depending on what TV show we came to terms with Superman. And the point is that if the Bible is true, and that, of course, is up for debate, but we have given extensive evidence for why we would say reasonably that it is true. Matt cannot say that we have not given evidence. It's the evidence that he just doesn't like, but it's evidence nevertheless. But when we look at the Bible, we began with God and his creation that involved the human being. And so the Bible teaches us that God interjected himself right from the beginning. From that point forward, man was operating already with the concept of God. And so the idea of a Superman came from the idea of a God that was initially instituted into the thinking of man. It's not the other way around. Magic came, more likely than not, from a corruption of an understanding of miracle. And God worked all through the ancient days in a miraculous fashion. As a matter of fact, by the time the story of the Egyptians unfolds in the book of Exodus, what were Pharaoh's magicians able to do already by that time? They had already developed a system of trickery. How did they come to terms with that? You have to keep your chronology consistent. It's not that we invented those things, it's that those things came from a mind that has already been introduced to concepts that could be reconstructed to give us something like a Superman or magic. Then he talks about, I lost my notes here, but then he talks about trust, and he says that he can trust various people, but that's not how he came off in the beginning when he made the statement that he does not trust people, and he was making reference to the witnesses of the Bible. And he made it into something else that we were not even addressing, and successfully diverted the force of that particular argument. He talks about the senses being untrustworthy. And we understand that the senses can be deceived, but we also understand that the senses are trustworthy. And so when we think about the senses, we know that they can be deceived, we know that they're trustworthy, we have to strike a balance. We do not automatically say that because the senses can be deceived, then I'm suspect of everything I see, everything I hear, everything I smell, everything I taste, and everything I touch. Our human mind and our consciousness gives us the ability to make fine-tuned adjustments that as we live life, we begin to understand what things may deceive us and what things are verifiable and true. We learn about mirages. We learn about light refraction. We learn about depth perception. We learn about all of these things, and then the mind, as it begins to figure things out, we develop a very elaborate system where we can trust the senses, and we understand that the senses can deceive us. And so we make certain that our steps are proper. Now he talked about where is the evidence that substantiates all of this that we've been talking about, and we've been saying that for the last 2 days. The evidence goes back ultimately to the Word of God. Now he said that other people have studied and have demonstrated that the Word of God is unreliable, and he leads us to a couple of websites. But we also have websites where we can go and we can demonstrate that the Bible is reliable. And unless you and I go to these things and think about these things rationally, we will never be able to determine for ourselves what is the truth regarding that particular issue. The point is, we understand that there are two sides to this question about whether or not God exists, about whether or not God is of human invention, about whether or not there is truth, reality, and any other question that is profound and significant in meaning. But until we take the time to actually sit down and consider the evidence, we will not know which side is true. But there is evidence. Mr. Delahunty acts as if there is no evidence. He keeps on saying, I have no good reason to believe this. Here is a book which is the result of 1,600 years, given to us by about 40 different authors. And as we begin to look at this book and analyze it, we understand that from Genesis to Revelation, with a 400-year period in the middle of silence, that these different authors from different places and different occupations, when they spoke with clarity. They spoke with precision, so that what we find in Genesis does not contradict what we find in Revelation. What we find in Romans does not contradict what we find in James. And sometimes these people were separated by thousands of years. Now, we understand that there are ostensible contradictions, and we don't deny that. The Bible itself tells you in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that there are some very difficult things to understand. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, Peter, talking about Paul and the wisdom that was given to him, wrote about some things which the unlearned and unstable twist to their own destruction. Even the Bible recognizes that there are some difficult parts that someone who's not developed their thinking will misapprehend. And if he or she misapprehends that, that will lead to a misinterpretation, which will result in a misapplication. Did not the Hebrews writer get after the first century Christians because by the time that they were taught about Melchizedek, they should have known more than they did? And Melchizedek is an obscure figure of Old Testament history mentioned just once there and another times alluded to in the New Testament. And there we have scant testimony that God utilizes through certain individuals that he speaks through to build a particular case, and though the evidence is scant, it's still enough to make a particular point. And the people who had to have a kind of developed thinking about the evidence and about chronology and about the situation, because they neglected their powers of reasoning that needed to be sharpened, they could not understand. It was not that God did not reveal himself. It was not that God did not offer a method. It was not that they could not do it because God gave them the ability to do it. It was because he or she failed to develop their own senses. He talks about a methodology of interpretation. How do we know? How do we know? Again, we go back to the Bible. The reason the Bible has been given to us in the manner it has been given to us, and just recognize it is a book. What does a book imply? It implies information. It implies that the person who is to receive the book has the ability to assimilate this information. There's a very elaborate process. It's called language. Language implies mind. Language also implies vocabulary, words, semantics, syntax. And there were some arguments that were made in the Bible that were reduced even to the grammar of a word. The Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians chapter 3 argued down to the plurality of a word. And so there is a very elaborate system that is identified in Scripture that helps us to learn to interpret not only the Bible itself, but ourselves and the world in which we live. The book of Proverbs in the very first chapter, the very first 6 verses teaches us that the Proverbs, which are profound, pithy statements, are designed to help us to sharpen our thinking. That the more we sharpen our thinking, the better discerners we become of language and everything else around us. If we want a method of interpretation, we turn to God, and he, through natural means and with the abilities that he's endowed us with, gives us the power to reason from point A to point Z. But Mr. Delahunty cannot even... Mr. Delahunty cannot even explain where consciousness came from that gives us the power to reason in the first place.
10 minutes cross-examination. Sure. So it's partly because I reject your contention that we have to know where it came from in order to be able to use it. I agree it would be helpful. So you said that the Bible is written clearly and precisely, and then you pointed out that there was arguments over grammar of a word, and that it recognizes that there are difficulties, and that you have to sharpen your thinking. What about the people who are mentally incapable of doing these gymnastics of studying to possibly come to the right answer?
When we look at the Scriptures, we are able to deduce that responsibility is the result of opportunity and possibility, or capability and opportunity equals responsibility. In a case where an individual is born with a deformity or with some type of defect, whether it be physical or mental, that prevents them from utilizing all of what God intended for them to have, then this is a matter that God himself will judge. It is a matter of clemency. And this, of course, we deduce from Scripture. You remember, as an example, from the New Testament, looking back into the Old Testament, there were certain qualifications that God accepted, though he had given a hard, fast commandment. The situation in the New Testament where one's ox fell into the ditch. And you remember under the Old Testament, violating the Sabbath was a no-no. And there were some very strict rules associated with that. But in the New Testament, as Jesus begins to explain how all of that functioned, Jesus also introduced that there were some qualifying items where when those items are set in motion, then they alleviate the person from responsibility. If I'm driving to worship God on a Sunday morning, which is a commandment that as a good Christian I want to honor and uphold, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, and all of a sudden I get a blowout, and I pull over to the side and I have to deal with that, and consequently it takes me several hours to deal with that, and I miss services. If God were to return at that very moment, is he going to say, guilty sinner? No. God is an understanding God. And there are certain things that will qualify responsibility when extenuating circumstances occur.
So if there's clemency as a basis of understanding, then maybe it's the case, for example, that baptism isn't required for salvation for the people who didn't understand that to be the case.
If we reason from the premise that we're talking about a person with his or her full mental faculties intact, then when we're talking about a particular doctrine of the Bible, he or she is responsible. Remember the construct that I gave. If there is capability and there is the opportunity, then responsibility is intact. And when that's the case, if we're dealing with a person of their full mental faculties, then we turn to the Bible and we begin to show them about baptism. And baptism is very clear. It's very surprising that he would bring up baptism with Churches of Christ, because in the history of Churches of Christ, I mean, we've done some extensive study in baptism. And baptism, as it is demonstrated and discussed in Scripture, is a point of doctrine where we can come to terms with it completely as God would have us to understand it. We know why God does not allow merely pouring or sprinkling, and we argue from the word itself, baptizo, and it means to dip, to fully submerge. We can go to the use of the metaphor in the book of Colossians, where the Bible refers to baptism as a burial, and we cross-reference that with the book of Romans in chapter 6, and how a burial must mean that one is covered, and how baptism is the only act of salvation wherein one comes in contact with the blood of Christ through faith. That's all throughout the Scriptures. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. And as we begin to think about the power of baptism, then baptism is the only means whereby God saves an individual. And so we take an individual carefully through the Scriptures and we show them everything the Bible teaches. And remember, we're assuming we're talking to a person who has all of their mental faculties operating. When that happens and the person is responsible, there is no clemency in that case, because there is no extenuating circumstances, no preventative circumstance that would keep them from understanding this completely.
So you said that I can't pinpoint the origin of Superman, and I don't mean in Krypton, but and I didn't even actually necessarily mean the guy with the big S on his chest. I'm talking about the idea of a Superman. And since I can't pinpoint it, your contention is that it's most likely that we couldn't have even come to the idea of a Superman if we didn't have this notion of God from God, that Superman is actually derived from God rather than derived from men. And why is it that it's impossible, according to you, for me to recognize that one man has greater capabilities than another, and then conceive of someone who has greater capabilities than that.
As we look at the history of all of this, the mysterious being in red and blue with the big S on his chest, we know as we go back to the 1950s, we know that the concept of Superman's there. I'm not sure if Stan Lee was responsible for him. He may be associated with another group there. I always get DC and Marvel mixed up. But if he's not talking about that, I can go back to the 1800s and I read there about one named Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. And he introduced the idea of the Übermensch, the overman or the Superman. And does Mr. Delahunty mean that? If I go further back, and remember, eventually I'm going to come to a point where I can no longer go back, where secular chronology ends, biblical chronology picks up. And I go back all the way to the beginning, and I find there that God, as he created man, man came to terms with his creator and already had a system of thinking about someone higher and superior. We don't know everything that we would like to know about Adam and Eve and about God and their relationship, but there are some indications that they had a very close relationship. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve had sinned and hid themselves, that God was walking in the cool of the day. And so there it demonstrates that God had a very personal relationship with his creation and had taught them several things. Now, when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, we understand all that happened there. Eventually, man's demise comes about. But if I see one man who is greater than me, yes, I can reasonably say, here is an individual that is superior than me in strength, in probably speed, in probably wit. But how do I reason from that to something that is infinite? There is nothing in nature that represents infinite. And please don't say a number, because numbers are not a part of physical nature. Numbers are abstract concepts. So there's nothing in nature that will point me to something superior in the same way that we describe God. And the very basis of God is infinity. Nothing in nature represents infinity. Pi is a number. Some clever arguments from others, they say, well, what if I put two mirrors, and as they bounce off each other, I can see, it seems forever. But that's contingent on the two mirrors. That's not even an example of infinity. What in nature teaches us about the infinite? And therefore, we depend on what the Bible teaches, and we reason from that by proper deduction.
All right, sounds like.
10 seconds.
Thanks. Your turn.
My first question for Matt is,
all right, guys, I'm gonna get out of here.
What is imagination